Welcome to Is 10 Too Young to be a Criminal? My name is Helena Goldberg. I'm director of Spike, the online publication, and author of Reclaiming Childhood. And I'm going to be chairing today's debate. I was at the conference yesterday as well, and there's been some fascinating debate, so I hope we can live up to the standard of the debates that I've been at here at the Battle of Ideas. What we're going to look at today is whether children have the capacity for moral agency, whether we should judge children by adult standards. Our speakers today we're going to kick off with Professor Raymond Tallis. He will be well known to many here, a regular Battle of Ideas participant. He is a fellow at the Academy of Medical Science, philosopher, author, always has interesting insights on a whole host of different issues, and is author of many books, including NHS SOS and Aping Mankind. We'll then follow with Dr. Nina Powell, who's a doctoral research fellow at the National University of Singapore and who produced today's session. Then Dr. James Treadwell, who's a lecturer in criminology at the University of Birmingham and author of Criminology, the Essentials, and last but not least, Luke Gidders, who is a solicitor, human solicitor, and legal editor of Spiked. So, without further ado, Ray.
Hello, thank you, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. In my opening remarks, I want to make comments on three areas. I'm going to talk about, first of all, the problems we have in making sense of the notion of an age of criminal responsibility. Secondly, I want to look at the temptation to look to science, in particular biological science, to deal with those problems and why this temptation should be resisted. And thirdly, I want to say how we should learn to live with uncertainty as to whether 10 or 12 or 14 or whatever is or is not too young to be a criminal. And all my remarks will be preliminary, and clearly things will develop during the course of our conversation. But let me begin with the problems that surround the very notion of setting an age of criminal responsibility. These problems are evident from the striking disagreements between jurisdictions as to when one should count as being a criminal, ranging from 7 to 18. This reflects our uncertainty as to what the notion of criminal responsibility means or implies, both in theory and in practice. In theory, being criminally responsible means you can have mens rea. You knew what you were doing, you knew that it was wrong, and were aware of its consequences for the victim. Now, this is clearly going to vary from person to person, yes, of course, but from crime to crime, from circumstance to circumstance, and between, say, impulsive actions, red mist, snap judgments, and so on, and on the one hand, to coldly calculated actions with an eye to one's advantage on the other. Criminal responsibility, like mental capacity in general, will always be circumstance dependent. So much for the theoretical problems. But then there are the practical consequences. Deciding that an individual has achieved the age of criminal responsibility influences not only the judgment of guilt for a criminal offence, but the choice of the processes of law, where and how the person, a child, is tried, considerations of fitness to plead, and also the punishment that is deemed appropriate. You have to remember that diminished responsibility is seen as a plea in mitigation rather than a defence supporting a plea of not guilty. So it's a great tangle. And there's clearly not going to be a yes or no answer to the question of this session. Is 10 too young to be regarded as criminally responsible? We're not going to be able to say yes at 11 and no at 9. It will vary, of course, from person to person, from crime to crime, and from social circumstance to social circumstance. Unfortunately, this doesn't inhibit the search for yes-no answers, and that search often leads to the supposed font of all objective wisdom, science. In particular, biological science, more particularly still neuroscience. And I have no hostility towards neuroscience. All my research is in the field of neuroscience, but I'm very anxious about its misuse. So it brings me to my second set of remarks. Now, it'll already be evident from what I've said that there's little rationale in the appeal to brain science, using, say, brain scans, to give an objective justification to decide whether an individual can be deemed to be criminally responsible. Brain scans take little account of all the facts that I've mentioned. So why are people seduced into thinking that brain science might help us? And why are people talking about a neuro-law, which will replace our untidy, unscientific judgments with more tidy biological ones? Well, of course, the attraction of using neuroscience is that it is possible to think of children with their immature brains as rather like being mentally disordered or impaired adults. But of course, brains mature at different rates in different individuals, depending on various biological and social factors. So wouldn't it be wonderful if we could put a child in a brain scan, see how well developed his or her brain is, and then decide whether he or she is criminally responsible? Now, just how unhelpful scans are as forensic tools, except in well-recognized cases of serious cerebral damage or disease, is demonstrated by a report that came out a few years ago from the American Psychological Association, which looked at what they call the anatomical immaturity of the adolescent brain. Now, we're talking about children pre-adolescent, but look at the evidence in relation to adolescent brains. What they found was that the areas of the brain supposedly responsible for risk assessment, impulse control, and high-level cognition are not fully developed in adolescence. What's new? Whereas the areas from which impulsivity and violence are supposed to originate are more active in teenagers than in adults. Could this be used, they said, to influence assessments of culpability and criminal liability, or to override the judgments we already make and the intuitions we already have based on experience and arguments derived from traditional sources? No, because of course only the minority of adolescents commit serious crimes. What's more, as the lawyer Stephen Morse has expressed it, whether adolescents, and this applies even more to children, whether adolescents are sufficiently less rational on average than adults, sufficiently less rational to treat them differently, is a normative legal question and not a scientific or psychological one. Biology can't answer normative questions, not only because moral norms sit very uneasily in biological discourse, but because the results of scans have to be calibrated against the usual tests of responsibility. So advances in brain scanning, or indeed other advances in neuroscience, or indeed other advances in biological science, are not going to help you unless you imagine that a sense of moral responsibility or criminal responsibility is a biological property like height or blood potassium levels. Now, this touches on another issue. If you believe that criminal responsibility is something you could treat as a biological parameter, this would still not help you to determine either the age of criminal responsibility, appropriate for a population as a whole, or to be absolutely certain that a particular individual is responsible or held justly responsible for his or her crimes. The concept of criminal responsibility will remain obdurately fluffy-edged, and so too will be any kind of normal range. We'll never be able to escape a trade-off between sensitivity and specificity. If you set the age of criminal responsibility very high, let's say 40, you will lose some people who might be regarded as criminals. Set it very low, you will get everyone who could be conceived to be responsible for any crimes they do, but will include many in whom it is patently wrong to ascribe criminal responsibility to them. And this trade-off between sensitivity and specificity appears in many other places as well. Any age that is chosen will, of course, reflect many aspects of our culture, not the least the way we view childhood and the process of growing up, which, as is evinced by our attitudes to child labour and to child warriors, will vary from place to place. It'll all depend on our notions of personhood and persons as agents, and our ideas about the ends and aims of punishment. As Jerry Maher has said, raising the age of criminal responsibility, let's say from 10 to 14 or 18, may have less to do with what psychologists tell us about the developing brain or mind than with a preference for non-punitive welfare measures, clearly a cultural rather than biological shift. But we need to start somewhere, and the best guess, say 12 or 14, may not be a bad place to start, so long as we don't imagine that this single measure, this single parameter, will be a sure guide to making the distinctions we need in an individual case. It's just a starting point for our judgment, not something that automatically delivers just treatment, which has an objective scientific basis, we fantasize, which would be reinforced by more science. That is just a fantasy. So I would kick off by saying we have to look beyond simple answers to what are intrinsically complex questions, and also learn to live with uncertainty as to whether or not 10 or 12 or 14 or whatever is or is not too young to be a criminal, and as to whether we're doing the right thing by treating someone at the age of 10 or 12 or whatever as a criminal. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So it's very difficult to draw a line in terms of saying here's a child and here's an adult. But so what do we know about what children do or do not understand about morality? Nina.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to address the issue of criminal responsibility from the perspective of a psychologist, and I research children's moral development. I think it's important to consider what it means to be a moral agent and be morally autonomous before we even begin to answer questions about how society and the criminal justice system should deal with children. The reason being is that understanding children's moral development and moral comprehension is going to set the backdrop for the discussion around the role and purpose of prosecuting children, as well as the discussion around when and if it is appropriate to compare children's intentions, beliefs, and desires to do or not do harm with that of an adult. So my main argument with respect to moral development is that attempts to look for early childhood or any kind of ground floor morality is problematic and is a shallow way of understanding human morality. I'm going to argue that to think young children can be morally culpable or even candidates for moral reform is to grossly misunderstand what it means to be moral, and that any expression of morality in early childhood is not comparable to the way in which we think of morality in adults. So first, let me just outline the research on moral development and moral reasoning. So in the psychology literature, and at the moment, the literature is heavily dominated by beliefs about intuitions from birth, universal moral faculty, so inherent moral principles. So a great deal of research happening at the moment suggests that human morality has an innate intuitive structure. Thus, we can detect moral wrongness in the world much like we can detect sort of grammatical wrongness in a sentence when we have that sense that something just isn't right. The argument for innate morality has led to more recent research with infant humans using a technique that tracks infant eye gaze. So René Baljean and Paul Bloom in the United States have found very interesting patterns in infant eye gaze in response to a puppet show where puppets or shapes perform helping or harming actions to another puppet or shape. And the acting puppet or shape is then punished or rewarded for their action. Infants are watching this, and they will typically gaze longer at situations where the harming puppet or shape is rewarded or the helpful puppet or shape is punished. The longer the gaze of the infant is due to what is claimed as the violation of their expectation, and their expectation being innate goodness and fairness. Baljean and others have used research findings like these to suggest early emergence of morality in the first few years of life. Often these findings are described in papers and conference presentations as demonstrating that children know the harmful puppet was naughty, therefore does not deserve to be rewarded. If the naughty puppet is rewarded, then the infants think that this is wrong. The problem with this interpretation is that an infant's ability to think something is wrong requires an immensely sophisticated cognitive structure. Essentially, infants have to hold a representation in their mind of a puppet's action, evaluate their negative or positive behavior, simultaneously hold representations of reward and punishment that is attributed, all the while making judgments of rightness and wrongness. It's quite a lot. The other side of the literature that is less popular is focusing on the stage-like development of morality. So this is the sort of cognitive developmentalist perspective that argues that an understanding of morality cannot exist independent of the development of theory of mind. Basically, theory of mind includes the development of the understanding of others' emotions, the ability to recognize others as having separate emotions from oneself, as well as the development of empathy and the understanding that someone can hold beliefs separate from your own, as well as separate from reality. Typically, these components of theory of mind develop no earlier in full form than the age of 5. The age of 5 aren't even sophisticated. Just this evidence alone makes it difficult to argue for innate moral understanding. If 12-month-olds are sophisticated enough to hold in mind mental representations of intention, wrongness, action, and punishment, as in the earlier studies I was describing, all the while evaluating rightness and wrongness, then logically we would have to argue that these infants regress as they develop, given we know that 3-year-olds cannot respond to these types of features, which seems unlikely. My own research has looked at the development of how children and adults blame people for wrongdoings, which is a facet of morality. It was only in adults' blaming judgments that I found a fully fledged moral understanding that incorporated both the cognitive sophistication needed to consider actions leading to a bad outcome, but also the rational understanding that blaming is only appropriate when bad outcomes are intended or foreseen. In my studies, even the older children aged 9 and 10 blamed incorrectly and irrationally by failing to take into account when the harm was intended versus accidental. All this evidence leads me to believe that moral thinking requires the unfolding of psychology and biology. Crudely, we need a brain, but a brain is not enough. We also need psychological development. And while it's tempting to see our understanding of right and wrong as being a natural-born human asset, we can't negate the development of theory of mind, which is how we come to understand any complex concept like morality. Looking for early innate or early emerging morality negates the whole of psychological development as not being important for how we come to understand morality. Additionally, human morality is not a fixed universal thing. Morality is constantly being negotiated through society and history, and relocating it into the mind of a child or an infant is to mislocate it and to misunderstand it. Morality is about the social world. You have to be a part of the world you live in to understand morality, and certainly as a young child, you're not necessarily a part of the social world, which is indistinguishable from the moral world. In other words, you're not a moral agent. In order for the child to have a grasp of morality, they need to have a suitably sophisticated cognitive system. And that system, as I've described, doesn't come online until at least 7, 8, 9 years of age. This is in part to do with brain and biology, but is also grounded in psychological development, which is grounded in being an active agent in the social world. Something more than mimicking rules that children can regurgitate from their parents and teachers, which is often confused with a sense of moral understanding. It's grappling with moral issues and the negotiations involved in understanding right and wrong as a person who not only expresses their own morality, but has revised it again and again and again through experience. In sum, the idea that society is dealing with a morally complete or competent moral being in early to mid-childhood is incorrect, because the foundation of morality is not in the mind of a child. It's later and it's continuous. This begs questions about whether it's appropriate to prosecute a child on the basis of having sophisticated intentions, desires, and beliefs about committing a moral transgression. If we assume that young children do not have a sophisticated moral reasoning system, then we are in danger of projecting our adult understanding of right and wrong onto that of a child. What kind of reform are we expecting to see from a child that has limited insight into their own moral responsibility and moral agency? I think in prosecuting children as we would prosecute adults, we are saying something very problematic about how we think of human morality in general, and we're reducing the complexity of moral agency down to something crude, unsophisticated, and shallow.
Thank you very much, Nina. And James, I presume from your work you have come across 10-year-old criminals, but is 10 too young to be a criminal?
Yes, and I'll outline why I think that now. I think from where I'd like to come from, I'm going to be talking from a sort of criminological point of view, and I think it's always easy to sort of get into the uncomplicated matters and to boil things down to sort of black and white issues. And unfortunately, that is what often happens when it comes to the case of children who commit crime. But I think what we're talking about is far more complicated. One of the first things I'd want to say is that, by and large, what we're talking about when we talk about crime often remains ill-defined and ill-considered. And one of the things we should note from the outset is that the sort of parameters of this debate are very often set by the exceptional. And to some extent, I'm going to be guilty of that in my response as well. Some of the cases I'm going to be talking about are exceptional. But I think what we ought to bear in mind and what we ought to remember is for the vast majority of young people coming into contact with the criminal justice system, it's not serious crime, it's not serious violence, it's not serious wrongdoing that brings them to the attention of the authorities. In the case of children that I've come across who have been brought in under the auspices of the criminal justice system, it's defacing the table of a popular fast food restaurant. You know, we are not necessarily talking about heavy and serious criminality. But that said, I think it's important to begin by recognising that by the age of 10, children very often do recognise the differences between right and wrong, and that's something that's very often been held up as the thing which determines at what age we should criminalise children. In the UK at present, that is 10. And very often we will hear people, and politicians of all political persuasions have been guilty of doing this. They say, at the age of 10, children know the difference between right and wrong, and that's okay then, because therefore we should criminalise them. But I think to simply boil it down to such a binary black and white criminality, into such a black and white issue as right and wrong, is in itself inherently problematic. To start off then, I want to start with a bit of a personal story. I was a youth offending team officer working in a youth offending team in Birmingham, and at that time I had a 12-year-old lad on my caseload. His name, I'll call him Jerome. I don't like young offenders being identified by real names, so it's a pseudonym. Jerome liked to smoke. He really, really liked to smoke. He liked cigarettes. I don't know if it was the cool image that he thought that they conveyed on him, but he constantly would badger me to buy him cigarettes. Come on, James, just nip and get us a pack of fags. Everyone on the estate will do it for me. Go on, James, go on. And I remember on one particular exchange where he was really trying to grind me down, and he got to me and he said, well, why not? And I said, well, you're just too young to make decisions of that sort of magnitude. You know, cigarettes damage your health and your future prospects. And there lay bare is the sort of irony of what we currently do. Jerome, not old enough to smoke, is old enough to be given an ASBO, to be put in front of the courts, to be given a criminal record that might blight the whole of the rest of his life. And those are the sort of issues that we're talking about. He was no lovable rogue. He was a nightmare. He was a problem on his estate. But he was a 12-year-old child as well. And I think we really need to get to grips with how we regard childhood and how we regard children. And I think we live in a very strange society at the moment where on one hand, children are held up as objects for protection and are loved and praised and cared for in a way that is wonderful. But at the same time, contradictory positions are very, very apparent. We can be very ephebophobic. We can fear children. And particularly when we look at, for example, our discourses on youth violence, on youth gangs, on criminality, very often it's a fear of children that propels them. We ourselves may have played football in the streets nowadays. Children playing football in the streets are regarded as a threat. They're regarded as problematic. They need the interventions of the criminal justice system. In other considerations, we accept as given that adults take responsibility for decisions affecting children, that young people don't have the capacity to make some decisions themselves. Yet when the capacity is that to commit crime, we simply, all too often and all too readily, reach for the label of evil. We condemn, we don't look for explanations, we don't look for anything deeper, we simply say that these children are evil or wrong, or that they are necessarily a problem. And in particular, that was the case with the murder by Robert Thompson and John Venables of James Bulger, which Blake Morrison says in his wonderful book, As If, you know, it's actually more a case in many ways of the murder of childhood, because from that the real consequence was, and the abolition of Dolly Inca-Pax, the increased use of child custody, an ever less tolerant criminal justice system, net widening and mesh thinning that brought more and more and more young people into the criminal justice system, but very little reflection from ourselves about what we were doing. That doesn't always happen, and very few people have heard of the case of Richard Keith in 1990, just a few years previous. Keith was an 11-year-old when he was convicted of the culpable homicide in Glasgow of a 3-year-old boy. Yet, in comparison, the public outcry simply wasn't there. There was no concern in the same way as there was in the case of Thompson and Venables. It may have been because that happened in Scotland, and there is a more enlightened philosophy there when it comes to youth justice, perhaps. It may simply have been that there were differences. There were similarly differences when we consider the Norwegian city of Trondheim and the case of Silje Redegard in 1994. Silje, a 5-year-old girl killed by 2 6-year-old boys who have never been identified. Of course, there are significant differences between these cases, and I wouldn't want to gloss over those. We know well now that James Bulger's killers were older, that they were also captured on CCTV, that there were nasty elements of that crime that weren't necessarily similar. But there were significant differences as well. In the case of Norway, the two 6-year-olds held responsible ultimately were never prosecuted and never brought into contact with the formal auspices of the criminal justice system. They had their school changed, they were put in place with educational psychologists, and they were met with concern for social welfare. That stands in marked contrast to how we still have a public outcry about Thompson and Venables. Even now, years later, that hasn't disappeared. And even after the release of the two boys, petitions continue to circulate asking us to keep them in custody for the rest of their natural lives. But I think what I'd want to highlight, to sort of finish off, is really to show some of these tensions, is to show that we are very, very confused about how we regard childhood in this country at the moment. And in order to sort of make that point, I'll take the case of the barrister Robert Colliver recently, who described the 13-year-old victim of a sex offender, Neil Wilson, as predatory and sexually experienced. And that led to quite a genuine public outcry. People were not happy at all to see that label applied. And I have to admit, I wasn't. But if we think about it, again here, we see fully our confusion about children and childhood, because we're all too happy and all too ready to describe children who commit serious offences as predatory. That's a label that sits incredibly happily with us. Now, I'm no biologist and I'm not a psychologist and I can't talk to medical matters, but one would assume that there would not necessarily be that much difference in the brain of the 13-year-old victim as opposed to the 13-year-old perpetrator. But what we also like to do is we like to separate the two off as if they can't exist together. When it comes to those young people who commit the most serious crimes in our country, they are very often the victims of hideous abuses, social exclusion, problematic parenting, difficult personal lives and difficult backgrounds. But we throw that away and we simply say that they are evil. And I think that that shows that really while there's been some progress in terms of how we think about children in some quarters, we're all too ready to discard that easily when children transgress the criminal law.
Okay, thank you very much, James. Now, Luke, you'll elaborate a bit more on the criminal justice system, what the reality is, and how did we come to the situation of viewing 10-year-olds as criminals?
Yes, well, in researching this session, I read a Home Office white paper from 1968. And to give you an idea of just how far we've come, this white paper said, "It is the small minority of children who go through their childhood without breaking the law. And it goes on to say it's a normal part of their development, and that if the judiciary and the judicial system got involved in this level of offending, it would have ludicrous consequences." Well, lo and behold, we now live with exactly those ludicrous consequences. And I think the reason we live with those consequences falls squarely at the feet of the new Labour government, who I think not only did they radically criminalise children in a new way, but they very effectively, I think, brought youth justice, effectively turned youth justice into a way of intervening in the family, intervening in what they had come to describe as problem communities. Under the new Labour government, youth justice became a new route into the family like it never had been before. So to explore that point, I'm going to have to talk about the law for a little while. And really the turning point, I think, is a good place to start is the Crime and Disorder Act of 1998. It still is the linchpin, really, of the statutory law which governs this area. And James mentioned it was the act that abolished Doli Incapax, which was the statutory, it was a common law presumption that children under the age of 14 were capable of forming mens rea. That act not only abolished Doli Incapax, but also introduced a whole raft of new powers to, once a child was before the criminal court, to use their presence there as a means for passing orders over other members of their family. The most obvious example was the antisocial behaviour order. The antisocial behaviour order could obviously be passed on a child or their parents in order to compel them to change the behaviour that had brought them to the attention of the authorities. But in addition to the ASBO, you also had parenting orders, which meant that any child who had an ASBO put on their head, their parents, if the child breached the ASBO, the parent could then have a parenting order put on them, which meant that they would be guilty of a criminal offence if their child breached their ASBO again. So effectively, you could end up with a situation where a whole family was controlled by different orders under one act. It was a very effective piece of legislation in bringing communities and families under the control of the law. But just to say a bit about where the Crime and Disorder Act came from, in the 90s, in the early days of New Labour, they really were searching for a purpose. And I think it was the death of James Bulger which really compelled them to reformulate themselves around the party of crime and law and order and social control. It was 3 weeks before the death of Jamie Bulger that Tony Blair, who was then Shadow Home Secretary, made his famous remark on being tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. And it was the death of James Bulger and the absolutely appalling way that those boys were spoken about, not just by the media but by the judiciary, the sentencing judge referring to them as their act as unparalleled evil, called monsters throughout most of the British media. Our judiciary, by the way, came under heavy criticism later by the judiciary in Europe, who said not only did these boys have an unfair trial, but you've treated them in an appalling way. And of course, it's not their issue to resolve, but it's worth at least noting. So then, this gave New Labour effectively a cause, a purpose. And what followed was a period of incredibly casually authoritarian lawmaking. The system that we have today is such a jumbled mess of punitive measures and welfare measures that you can't. It's completely reflective of the fact that there was absolutely no thinking behind it whatsoever. It was pretty much reform for reform's sake. But as I said at the beginning, what they did effectively do was provide themselves with another mechanism of intervening in what they'd come to call problem communities. So a year after the Crime and Disorder Act, you had what's known as the referral order system coming into play. Now, if your kid never comes into contact with the criminal law, you might not know about referral orders, but if your child commits a completely not very serious criminal offence, so for example, if they break a window or something, and they go before the magistrate's court, and they plead guilty at the first opportunity, it's almost mandatory for the magistrates to pass what's called a referral order on them, which means that they have to then report to the youth offending team, sometimes for months on end. They're also and then they become subject to effectively the will of the youth offending team as to what further interventions will be required to put them on the straight and narrow. So what you have is, in contrast to the 1968 Home Office White Paper, you have now a system where any child that commits a criminal offence will effectively end up under the monitoring of the youth offending team. The youth offending team effectively get to decide what level of intervention they think is suitable for this particular child. And that process is arrived at almost with no judgment whatsoever, because it's effectively a mandatory sentence. So, coming on a little bit further, in 2003, you then had, well, just on the Crime and Disorder Act again, the Crime and Disorder Act introduced the power for local authorities to impose curfews, local authority curfew orders, which meant that local authorities could just say young people can't be here after a certain time in this space. They developed that in 2003 when they introduced the power for a police officer to, if they thought that a young person's presence in a particular area might, and that's the word in the statute, might cause someone harassment, alarm or distress, they were given the power to effectively move them on. So what you have is a new power of arrest for children who are behaving in a certain way. Police have now effectively a completely different set of powers in dealing with young people, which has seemingly come out of nowhere. And the one thing I would question in respect of James's remarks and the discussion on James Bulger is that I think it's actually more worrying than claiming that it was a response to public outcry. Because reading about this, I didn't see any evidence of massive public outcry calling for the prosecution of these boys. I didn't think it was a public drive to have these children tried as if they were adults. I think this was a purely figures in authority driving this. And I think it had what's more frightening is that it had absolutely no bearing on how the public felt about the case, had absolutely was not reflective of any broader social change in how we think about children and whether or not we should have them in front of the criminal courts. So very quickly in sort of summation, I think, well, what does all this matter? And some of the other speakers picked up on it. I think what matters about the age of criminal responsibility is that it informs our understanding of young people committing crimes. It explains and forms a frame of reference for how we think about children committing criminal offences. And we can come back to this, but this is polarised when we talk about gang culture, because so much of the time we are desperate and willing we've become desperate and willing to interpret young people committing criminal offences in adult terms. So when a young kid goes out and kills another kid, we are desperate to describe it as an incident of gang violence because that somehow relates to our adult morality in some way. It's an easier way of understanding it. It provides it a degree of narrative. And of course, the real danger is that this becomes self-perpetuating. So that's just sort of a question to throw out to the audience. Well, I think the real problem with the way that we talk about young people, the way that we talk about youth offending, is that it actually shapes our understanding of the offences themselves and creates a very dangerous environment for young people who are involved in crime, who are involved in criminal offending, to get out of it.
Thank you very much. Can we thank the speakers? And we've covered quite a lot of ground, and I think you're absolutely right, Ray, when you made the point that you can't sort of categorically say, here you have moral agency, or here you don't have moral agency, and whoops, here it's just arisen. But isn't it important, or I wonder what you think about this question, about is it important to distinguish between adults and children? For society to make that distinction, which is a fairly recent thing. And is that a progressive thing? Is that an important thing? And we seem to be losing that distinction today. And you sort of pointed to this, James, where there's a sort of schizophrenic attitude, isn't there? In many ways, we don't see 18-year-olds as adults, do we? Because they have to be taken to freshers' fairs by their parents, which would have been just balmy when I was 18 years of age. Yet, you know, there was a Panorama programme a few years back where they talked about children who were in nursery sexually abusing each other. And they had been expelled from nursery. So we judge children's behaviour by adult standards. And is there not something really problematic there? So I was just wondering whether any of the speakers have got any views on, well, is it important for society that we distinguish between adults and children, and why? And why have we got this messed up view?
I mean, I think it is important we maintain this distinction, but it's equally important we recognise, first of all, it isn't a sharp distinction, and secondly, it applies differently to different things. I would take the analogy that I'm sure Luke would resonate to, is that of mental capacity. To have mental capacity, it'll vary depending on how complex the issue you're dealing with. So you may be able to have mental capacity to decide whether or not it's appropriate for you to have an operation when a surgeon offers it to you, but you may not have mental capacity to deal with very, very complex financial affairs. And it seems to me that going from childhood to adulthood, various, as it were, things happen, various capacities are acquired. They're acquired at different ages by different people, by different individuals, but there are different facets of the difference between childhood and adulthood. So we can maintain the distinction, recognise it isn't sharp, recognise it is a multifaceted distinction, and recognise that it will take place in different people at different times, which is not very helpful for the law, but I think it's helpful for our humane response to children.
Yet the law has to set age, doesn't it?
Indeed, and the law can start off with a rough guess, whatever you put it at, but always know that that's a rough guess and up for nuancing, shaping, changing, and so on.
And I'd add to that at the moment that we don't set it as a rough guess. We use the age 10 though, and that age is way too young.
Absolutely.
The evidence from neuroscience tends to point out, I believe, that even the teenage brain isn't fully developed in terms of assessment of risk and so on. But more than simply that, it sets us in stark contrast with most of Europe and most of the rest of the world, in actual fact. And that is really an issue. The UK signed up to the United Nations Convention on Rights of the Child in 1992. One of the requirements of that, although not expressly stipulated, is that the age of criminal responsibility is not set too young. That's a bit misleading, but the Beijing rules, slightly separately, suggest that when it comes to the age of criminal responsibility, it should be held at around about the same age as making democratic choices, for example, consent, age of sexual consent, consent to medical treatment without parental responsibility. And at the moment, none of those in our country stand at 10. It's only that age of criminal responsibility. So is 10 too young to be a criminal? Yes, for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm not afraid of saying that I think there should be, when the law is involved, a clear line, and it's inevitable that the law has to do that. And I was discussing this issue about a month ago, 6 weeks ago, and you should see the reaction you get if you suggest that the age of criminal consent should be 18. The room goes berserk and says, how would that possibly work? And you say, well, it works in other countries, it works in other European countries. And I think really it's a question, as far as the law is concerned, it's a question of at what point do we say that you are a member of our moral community to the point that we are going to try you in the same way as everyone else. Because if a criminal trial is anything, it's a social ritual. And of course, ritual and performance is at the heart of our justice system. So we don't only value justice being done, it's justice being seen to be done. So the question is, at what point do we say that that act is deserving of the same social ritual as adults? And I think you picked up on one justification for it being 18, actually, because you see this in the discussion around youth voting. And you hear arguments like, oh, you can get married at 16, you can fight a war at 16. But actually, neither of those things are true. You can get married at 16 with your parents' consent. You can join the army at 16, but you can't fight on the front line. And the reason why is we don't value your decisions until you're 18. We don't value people's decision-making until they're 18 years old. And so it's all about the power of, what that reflects is that we don't take people's judgments very seriously until they're 18, and rightfully so. So and I think that also has to do with, we recognise that the process of forming the judgment which is necessary to put your life on the line for a country or to vote for a political party takes time of being independent. And most 18-year-olds today are not independent. Most 21-year-olds aren't dependent. I mean, if anything, I'd say you could even raise the age of criminal responsibility a bit higher than 18. I mean, I think you could really just keep going up a little bit further, because it's about when you become truly independent, when your decision-making becomes independent of the institutions which govern your existence. And I think as that gets later and later, there may even be an argument for pushing the age of criminal responsibility further up.
I think instead of looking at the distinction between adulthood and childhood, as you put it, I'm more keen to see an understanding of childhood as something you get through to get to adulthood, and that development is continuous and negotiable. And yes, there are certain things that children cannot do and they will not understand. And they're very good at mimicking certain things to look like they have an understanding, so they can effectively answer questions about morality in a very crude way. They can, detect rightness and wrongness on a very base level and based on something that they've been taught and they're mimicking from their parents or teachers. But I think it's important to not necessarily have this crude cutoff between adulthood and childhood, and to focus more on just less emphasis on childhood, really, actually. Like, it worries me that the emphasis on the child in any way, whether it's criminal child or the all-important, all-encompassing, life-changing experience of having a child and being a parent or whatever it is, it's doing something strange to sort of taking away from what I think of as the importance of adulthood and the importance of getting through a period of time where your development is all over the place and eventually get to the sophisticated point of being not only cognitively mature but experience rich and able to make complex decisions and revise those decisions again and again because you have an agency and a place in the social world. So I'm just worried, I guess my take-home point is I'm worried that in focusing on the criminal age of responsibility is somewhere between the ages of 10 and 18, that we're doing something weird about, we're reducing what it means to be a fully fledged person and a fully fledged moral adult into something that's really quite immature and not necessarily recognizable in what we used to think of as human morality.
So it degrades what it means to be an adult and be responsible for your own actions if suddenly 10-year-olds... Right, quick point, and then we'll throw it out to the audience.
Yes, I mean, I couldn't agree with Nina more. I mean, essentially, if you adultise children, you infantilise adults. I mean, sort of, and I would sort of shrink from the idea that childhood is just a journey, that children are merely human becomings as opposed to human beings. That would worry me a bit, because that's to instrumentalise childhood somewhat. But I want to pick up what Luke said. It seems to me that we do have a trade-off between what we might call sensitivity and specificity. If you set the age of criminal responsibility at 25, then clearly you're going to miss a few characters in whom it would be appropriate to ascribe full criminal responsibility. If you set it at 8, then you have a very, very over-sensitive measure of what it means to have criminal responsibility, and you bring in some people in whom it's entirely inappropriate. So there's bound to be a trade-off. One of the things interesting me about different jurisdictions is how all 4 Nordic countries, Scandinavian countries, all choose 15. If 4 Scandinavian countries think it's right, that sort of makes me stop a little bit.
We aren't right about everything. And Trondheim, by the way, is my hometown. Right, quite a lot of hands here.
An interesting discussion, but where does it actually leave the victims of these crimes or their families? You know, we're not saying they're responsible, but an actual criminal act has actually happened. How do we acknowledge the victims and their families? How do we leave them feeling as if the harm that they've suffered, and it could be quite serious harm, has been acknowledged or anything's been done about it?
One quick point on the Celia thing, just in relation to that, because it is a heartbreaking story, and the way in which the mother of Celia found out who it was that had taken Celia's life was when she went round to the house of the woman who she knew had tried to resuscitate her daughter. And she said the police hadn't told her anything yet. She didn't know whether it was sexual abuse because Celia's clothing had been removed. And this woman was sitting with her son on her lap, and she said, "Have they not told you what happened? It was my son. He's the one who pushed her over." And she said she felt terrible because she couldn't stay in the room with this boy. She said she had to leave the room, but she said, "How can I blame him? He's a child." Yeah, so it wouldn't help her in any way to say he should be treated like a criminal. She never wanted him treated like a criminal. That wouldn't help her. But she said she had to fight against any anger towards him and just leave because she couldn't deal with it. But she had lost her daughter a few hours earlier.
And that's my point. What was then done? Something should have been done for her. Whilst you couldn't criminalise the child that had actually committed the act, she still needed to be acknowledged that she'd suffered harm. Therefore, should it be the role of the state to still provide some support or help for her? Because that was the whole problem with Jamie Bulger's mother. She had absolutely no support at all, and so then is left feeling very bitter and ignored for years and years. If perhaps we respond better to victims, they won't be demanding the blood of young children who commit crime, because there's still a system there to actually assist and still acknowledge the harm that the victims suffer.
Okay. I mean, there is something we can touch upon, but we should concentrate on the whole question of whether 10-year-olds can be criminals and whether it's going in the right direction. Yep.
There is also the perspective of children who get involved in crime, their perspective themselves. And I spend much of my life working in a community where there's a lot of what is called, there are a lot of what are called child criminal gangs and child criminal activity. And this is based on the idea that certain acts actually are crimes. Like, for example, if you steal something, we call it a crime. If you murder somebody, we call it a crime. And unfortunately, some children do get involved in these things. And I just wanted to relay to you an experience of mine when I was taking 3 children in my car, actually to see an educational psychologist, and they were talking about a crime that had just been committed in which they had some involvement. They were all members of a group of children who termed themselves a gang, and one of those children, aged 14, was killed by having a knife put through his neck by a 16-year-old. And one of the children in the car with me had been aged 10 and standing over the victim as he died. The blood was coming out of him. And the children were, these 3, they were aged 8, 10, 12 probably, and they were saying to me they were outraged because the boy who had committed the crime was now going to be locked up for 22 months. They thought that was outrageous, and they said, if you take a life, you give a life. Isn't that right, miss? Isn't it right? And they also said that when the 16-year-old was released, he would probably be killed by somebody else. And if he wasn't killed in this country, when he was probably sent home to Morocco, which they thought would happen, his brother would actually do this deed. And I think, do we not have to take into account the fact that children are conscious that there are some acts that are crimes, and how are we going to deal with this?
Not really about kids murdering other kids, more banal everyday stuff. I've talked with my husband quite a lot about how things used to work when we were kids, when us and other kids that we knew did things like nicking sweets from shops, stealing, throwing things at people's windows, which then sometimes broke them. These types of things, just routine things that used to go on, and how people used to think about it, how we used to think about it, and how people in the necks of the wood where we grew up thought about it. And what it used to be thought about, I think, was bad behaviour. And what used to happen, for example, with a shopkeeper running the paper shop over the road from where I grew up, he used to give people a good clip round the ear. He used to march them home, and if the mum was in the next day, she'd get a good rollicking too. That's basically what he did. Ditto with things to do with windows, nicking stuff out of people's gardens, rat-a-tat ginger repeatedly, which I now view would probably be called harassment. It was probably really, really irritating for everybody's neighbours. I sound like a really terrible person. I'm sure I'm normal. These types of things that we get up to. And there was... I genuinely don't think there was any sense in the areas where we grew up, which were just ordinary areas of the Midlands and Kent, that any adults would ever have involved the police. It never have entered anybody's head. There was just this kind of fairly powerful activity amongst people that lived in the communities. It happens particularly men who... were sometimes not very nice to the kids that were doing this, including my husband. But that's how it went on. And the reason why I'm saying this is that one of the things I find interesting about this discussion, I was talking to Helen about it, that at one level, there seems to be very little support for the idea that the age of criminal responsibility should be 10. Everybody on the panel is arguing very strongly about it. There is no legal literature. The position in the academic world is completely consensual, so you're mainstream. I'd be interested to know more the people that you say, thought it was really weird if you said he should be 18. I almost come across nobody at a formal level who thinks that 10 is anything other than completely ridiculous. Yet it is. And I'm just trying to work out kind of how that could be, and whether what's gone on, and whether insofar as there is a sense for a kind of support or rationale or ability for it to stay at 10, is just underpinned by this steady, continual erosion over 2-3 decades now of a sense that within communities you just sort your kids out, that's what you do, and you just make them behave and you coerce them. That's what people do as parents. We do coerce our children. We make them do things they don't want to do. In communities, people coerce other people's kids. They make them do things they don't want to do. And somehow or other, as adults, we now live in a situation, I think, where... even saying that, the idea that actually it's right for adults to coerce children, people probably think that's a terrible thing to say. But I actually think it's a statement of fact. Adults have to coerce children. You have to make them do things they don't want to do. And I wonder whether one conclusion that you could draw from that, kind of ironically, is that the underpinning for, or part of the underpinning for, a really dreadful and horrible criminal justice system now, which treats children in the most horrific manner, is actually the cult of child protection, ironically. The idea that, no, we should never coerce children, you know, we can't make them do anything they don't want to do, we've always got to protect the child, is somehow the flip side of a coercive criminal justice system.
I was a bit alarmed by Raymond's sort of view of a sort of mechanistic view. He kept talking about the human brain as they were all battery chickens and our brains develop and then they reach a certain point. What seemed to be missing to my mind was the fact we're not like chickens. We live in a culture, we live in a world which has certain values which we learn. And formerly I might have agreed with the lady here. What she's really talking about, though antipathetic to the criminal justice system, was actually that the majority of people in society knew what was right and wrong, and they therefore told their children, and when the children transgressed, they ticked them off. And that was good. What we have now is a total confusion in society of what is right and wrong, how we should behave. And this comes back to the previous talk on role models. No one really knows what sort of role model. Should they be footballers? Should they expose themselves? What should they do? And there's just a total confusion. And this is the problem, that if we only knew what was right and wrong, we would actually be able to tell the children. And so when Nina says, oh, well, their mothers only told them something and it didn't really matter because they didn't really understand it. Of course they don't really understand it because they're children. But they were told what was right and wrong, and they grew up with that view. Finally, you could say in Dickens's Oliver Twist, you had Fagin's gang. God knows whether they were 12 or 10 or what they were, and the Artful Dodger. But they suddenly knew what was right and knew was wrong, and what was the consequence of it, because society had these values that had inculcated them, and it was rough and it was awful, but they did have a consensus. We have no consensus, and children, it's not surprising, children don't know how to behave. And in a way, I'm sort of sympathetic. 10's awfully young in a society like ours.
I think, just some buzzwords to start with, the politics of fear, I think, surrounds this. The elevation of the victim in crime and the criminal justice system, which I think is an absolute catastrophe, and risk management. So you get a situation in the 90s, I thought it was very useful summary there. Essentially, 10-year-olds, young children and then youth had been portrayed as a problem for communities and society. And so communities were seen as at risk from children. So you then lower the age. You then get a situation of 2 10-year-olds taken to the Old Bailey for rape, for doing doctors and nurses, because children have been elevated in terms of risk, in terms of what they do. Ironically then, those 10-year-olds turn up in the court and they're given teddy bears and cuddly toys and all the rest of it, because courts now reckon, you know, they say the children are vulnerable, so we must treat them accordingly. You've got this bizarre situation in Scotland where they're going to give the vote to 16-year-olds, but they've raised the age to 18 where you can buy cigarettes. Why? Because it's a risk, right? And you can't handle it. They also tried to pass a law that you couldn't buy alcohol from supermarkets until you were 21, because again, it's categorised within the framework of risk. And perhaps more controversially, the last one is you get 14 and 15-year-olds who have sex with pop stars are now seen purely through the prism of victimhood and appear to have no sexual agency whatsoever. And I mean, it's a while since I was 14 or 15, but it's not the girls I seem to remember.
Well, recently I turned 11, and by the time you get to 9, you know that when you're 9, you know the difference from right and wrong. And so, but you don't always have, your emotions can overwhelm you. You don't have control over your actions. So for me, 10 is too young to have criminal. You can't, because when you're an adult, you have more self-control, and when you're a child, that's what one aim of a parent is, to teach your child to have self-control. And when you're in that age group, you don't have self-control, really.
Here, here. Any comments, anything you want to come back on?
Just a quick one on the gentleman's total misrepresentation of what I said. I actually said precisely the opposite of what you said I said, and I've written loads of books against biological determinism. And I looked at my text in case I've been reading it upside down or the wrong text, and I specifically point out that brain scans and looking at the brain isn't going to help us to sort out this problem. So you must have fallen fast asleep at the first sentence I started speaking, and I apologise for being so boring and putting so quickly into a coma. So that's dealing with that. But some quick points. It seems to me that there is a worry that in order to be just to the victim, we have to be unjust to the perpetrator. That in other words, the outrage and the sorrow and the grief of the victim, all of which are very real, should leave you basically to be very harsh towards the perpetrator. And I think we have to separate the needs of the victims from appropriate justice towards the perpetrator. Ellie's point about a lot of what is now regarded as crime is Dennis the Menace stuff, which we all cheered on when we read it in the Beano, is absolutely right. And criminalising minor transgressions, even in the sort of intermediate sort of thing of ASBOs, is a very worrying thing indeed. I could say lots of others, but I don't know hog the conversation.
Yeah, no, I'm very concerned that we don't simply fall into a trap of saying everything now is terrible, that it's much worse than it ever has been. And one of the things that I'm reminded of, first off, when it comes to playing on the popular sentiment for punishment, I think it is well-founded that the public do tend to support harsh punishments by and large. And New Labour's reinvention actually came from Blair learning lessons from the Clinton administration in the United States of America, then importing them back, but also from the fact that he was up against Michael Howard as Home Secretary, so one and another ratcheted up, Shadow Home Secretary then, ratcheted up policies. But I think there's something interesting in how society has changed and where it has changed. And while I'm keen to avoid this sort of mantra of, everything has gone downhill, I think society has changed to some extent. While on one hand, David Cameron travelled straight to Doncaster to launch his speech on Broken Britain. Broken Britain arose out of a speech about two young boys perpetrating a nasty, violent crime again, once again playing to the gallery. What we perhaps ought to say is that there is perhaps a void where it comes to morality. I agree with much of what the gentleman over there said about our concerns with risk management, our elevation of victimhood, but I also think that there is something to be said about how as a society we are confused about morals and values and what we expect from children, because much of the sort of behaviour of the young street criminals that would attach themselves to the gangs described previously is instrumental, self-interested, and is very, very similar to that caused the financial crisis in 2008. If we have a problem with values, then it doesn't necessarily start off with 10-year-olds in Doncaster. It might well be woven into the social fabric at a much more fundamental level. And I think we really ought to debate that. And there are problems about our current value system and how we place the expectations on children to grow up quickly into an adult world. But I think those are very, very far-reaching questions.
Okay, Nina.
I just want to come back on Ellie's point. I think it's really important to talk about the sort of more minor, what you might call offenses now, or sort of mischievous behaviors that kids engaged in and still do, because it's not just something that now we're problematizing and we didn't at one time. It's actually how children learn morality. And the problem with reducing morality to something biological and innate is that you stop asking questions about how, why, and where does morality come from. Morality comes from testing the boundaries and understanding that when I do something naughty, that there's a punishment, and not just a punishment, but that it affects others. If somebody else is, it's how we develop a sense of empathy. One of my favorite examples of this in the cognitive development literature is actually children's development of lying. So when children are starting to test the understanding of the fact that people can hold beliefs separate from their own, and they can hold beliefs that are separate from reality, they engage in a lot of lying behaviors. They start to tell fibs. And a lot of parents get really concerned at a certain age, just like, my kid's a liar, just goes around lying to me about everything. And it's actually really interesting, the research that came out from this is showing that, this is how children test something that just came online. Something has come online, they have an understanding of false belief, and they now want to explore it further, and it becomes not only interesting for them, but just a way of further developing that sophistication. So I think it's really important, and I want to shy away from trying to reduce morality to something so uninteresting and uncomplicated and lacking in such sophistication that we now forget that actually children need to go through wrongful actions and behaviors that have consequences before they start to develop a sense of the fact that this is wrong or right, and that's what makes it come online through the experiences. So I just wanted to make that point.
Yeah. So yeah, part of developing that morality and internalising it is actually finding ways of testing the boundaries, isn't it? And we all did that. And adults were very authoritative with us in basically saying, you've broken, you know, you've tested that boundary, you've gone too far. But at the same time, they knew that that's just normal part of growing up, and they didn't treat us like adults.
And what, just one last thing, is what will happen if we focus on the sort of crude detection of morality that we're focusing on now in early childhood and infancy, is that you will end up with, I worry, I guess, that children and adolescents and even adults who have a very crude binary understanding of right and wrong that is parroted down from authority or parents or the state or whatever it is, and no ability to detect the nuance because that's not how they developed a sense of morality. And that is a problem, I think.
So in the Victorian era, there was no concept of childhood. They were known as little men or little women. And you've talked about how the brain has to sort of develop enough for you to be able to be old enough to be classified as a criminal. So what I was wondering is, if, say, we once again did get rid of this notion of childhood and, you know, the right conditions were there, would it be possible for 10 to now become an age where children could be held criminally responsible?
I just want to say that, I just want to start by saying I'm not an adult and I'm not a parent either. And I just want to start by saying that there's a tendency as a society now to look at criminals and child criminals in particular through our own eyes, and we're unable to be, as you could say, empathetic towards children. So when we, you know, judge a child's action as a crime, we're looking at it through our own eyes, not through their own eyes themselves. So I think we need to practice a bit of understanding in why a child does an action and what has led to those actions and what those actions resolve in.
Okay.
I just wanted to put in a bit of a plug for professionals who do work with children all the time, like youth offenders and particularly the school system. Not that I like making schools the panacea for all our society ills, but, you know, we do deal with children and their strange and abnormal behaviours all the time, and really do help children to get over the mistakes. I particularly liked what you said about, you know, trying things out and having another go. And, you know, it's not just parents, it is other professionals who do help children to grow up and to understand morality. And I disagree with the gentleman here, because I actually think that, I mean, there's always exceptions, of course, as we see in the big cases, but the majority of children do understand right and wrong and are helped to understand that through their nurture and also through making mistakes and having another go to get it right next time.
I just wanted to ask a simple question. From time to time, the idea comes round that, from politicians mainly, that professionals should intervene with children before they've committed crimes, that they're identified as coming from problem families. And I wanted to ask if you think that's a good idea, or whether is that just labelling children as criminals before they've even got there?
Are there any of these questions you can come back on briefly now before we take the last questions? Right, Luke and Ray.
I'd like to pick up on this victim question. What happens to the victims? Because it was at the same time that New Labour were, you know, running roughshod over children, that they were talking a lot about victim-centred justice. It was Jack Straw that came up with the idea that the justice system should effectively reorientate around the needs of the victim. And of course that's been catastrophic for defendants' rights. And in fact, up until the 90s, you don't really see much mention of the victim in court cases, because they're not a party. It's the Crown against the defendant. And the judgment that's being made in the course of a criminal trial is whether or not the defendant deserves to lose their liberty. Of course, the victim of their offending is going to go through a tough time, but the state has no role in assisting them through that personal problem, that personal tragedy, if it was a tragedy. But the one example I would cite was I got burgled very recently in New Cross, And the police actually really buy into this idea, because if you get burgled in New Cross, which is actually 3 times in 1 year, they send round community support officers to knock on your door and ask if you're okay. And the 3rd time I was burgled, I didn't call the police because they just became a pain. It just became a real inconvenience having to answer the door and explain that I was still okay. Very, very quickly, if I could just talk, because this point about community, I was thinking also about about the police and the police's role in the community, because I sort of had a bit of a moment yesterday when I thought, well, the police went under a period of great reform. You know, you used to have the life on mile style policing where pretty much anything goes, and now they're so heavily regulated that they basically can't behave informally at all. Everything they do has to be logged. They have to justify everything they do. They can't, for example, drag a scrote off the street, throw them in the back of a police car, drive them around and then let them out again, because they'd have to justify it. So I think, ironically, at the same time as the police were becoming regulated so they had to record their police interviews and not beat up defendants in custody, which is probably a good thing, at the same time they were losing any power whatsoever to behave informally. So maybe that actually has... And so they actually now are compelled to prosecute kids because they have to justify their initial actions.
Right.
There were very good questions on the back about childhood and whether it's a very recent concept. I mean, if you look at the history of childhood, childhood first came to the upper classes, as it were, and you only acquired childhood, as it were, if you were working class, very, very recently, comparatively, historically. And the result is we don't have a clear idea what a child is. La Rochefoucauld famously said before he had children, he had 6 theories about children. Then he had 6 children and no theories. And it just seems to me that we're in a situation where we can't quite work out what a child is. Is a child just an incompetent adult? Is it a human becoming as opposed to a human being? Is it one of us, but, you know, shorter stature and so on and so forth? So I think your question's a very good one, because we have some of the sociologists, historical sociologists, have talked about the invention of childhood, you know, and the invention of the child. So I think we need to open the discussion precisely in the direction that you have opened it up.
You were saying that you got asked to buy some cigarettes from a 12-year-old, but I was just wondering that, like, would you think of that as a serious crime? But in their eyes, they would just think of it as not such a big crime, like they were just trying it out maybe more than one time. And I've had experiences in my school when people of the age of 14, even younger, like 13, have been just trying that. But you would think, oh, that's a crime. But they would probably think, no, that's not a crime, I'm just trying it, that I'm too young to commit a crime. I was just wondering if you were describing that as a crime or just no.
No, the reason for sort of mentioning it is that for all the reasons that I wouldn't buy cigarettes for, I don't it would rank particularly on the criminal offence scale, although I do believe you could be prosecuted for buying cigarettes for a child underage. It wouldn't rank as particularly serious for me, but all the consequences, all the reasons that we'd say to a child, you shouldn't smoke, are all those that you would immediately bring on them by putting them into the auspices of the criminal justice system in many ways, because the moment that you do that, you do really damage their future life chances.
I feel that there's a sort of fairly cosy kind of agreement amongst the panel, and just to push you a little bit, a couple of points. One, in London, sadly and rarely, there are youth killings, and just often involving 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds, really pretty brutal stuff. And I wonder, just to push you, you're really saying those people shouldn't be treated as criminals. You're really saying they have to be at 18, or you said even higher. I think that needs to be tested a little bit. The second point, just on adult, and somebody mentioned something about the thirst for punishment amongst adults generally. I used to think I was pretty left-wing and liberal, but quite often I open the papers today and look at some of the punishments that are passed on adults, and actually I do go, that seems absurdly soft. Now, is that just me sort of becoming old? Or has the state actually, I think, for adults, lost the willpower sometimes to really lay down some pretty tough messages? Sometimes I feel there's a sort of almost moral relativism about adult crimes.
I'd like to make 2 really quick points. The first is to really agree with Ray when he suggests that perhaps the most useful way to go is to start talking about what a child is, because what immediately follows from that discussion is we have to then decide what do we want to do to children when they come into the world. And the surely the most essential thing has to be that we have to orient them in a way that they can make sense of the world that is going to be fundamentally confusing to really young people. And we can then, I think, so going down that route of saying what is a child is sort of saying what do we want a child to be, and from that I think a useful discussion can flow. The second is very small, which is that I think it's just a thought that's come into my head. It's like the span of childhood has increased historically with a and what's been congruent with that is a less heightened sense of what it is immediately that person in that social class has to do. So the reason why childhood was invented perhaps for upper class people is because upper class people didn't have a sort of easily defined role as, say, working class people. You had to go out and earn a living. I'm wondering why. So where does that leave us? If we're all sort of lost as what we need to do, then is childhood going to go on forever?
I was just wondering, obviously children do grow up and mature at different ages, and I'm just wondering if you have child carers, like young carers, who from a very young age take on lots of responsibility. They obviously have a strong sense of, well, you know, I would presume morality would come in that because they're having to make quite tricky decisions in the house. Would you then say that if they then committed a crime, looking at the way that they have lived and the immense maturity for their age, you could then say that they would be culpable because they'd have the mental capability?
So we'll sum up then in reverse order of the introduction. So Luke.
Yeah, so just a couple of points. One on serious crimes, so kids committing serious offences, is a really important question. And obviously a lot of these cases just are absolutely awful. But the one thing I'd say is the question you have to ask is not, do you treat this murder like any other murder? Do you treat it like an adult murder? And I think if you ask that question, it should always be no. It's not the same thing as an adult murder. Often these cases are tragic incidents of sort of adolescent falling out, and it's helpful for the justice system to treat it that way, which is why I'd say that it comes back to that point about what's the point of a trial. It's a social ritual, and actually laying that distinction between a child killing another child as a tragic incident of childhood, you know, of whatever it is, versus an adult murder, which is a choice that someone has made, which we value and recognise. Well, not we value the decision to kill someone, but we recognise that that is a judgment that they've made. The child hasn't made the same judgment, even though they've done something which is absolutely appalling. I think the departure has to be that in the child murder, they haven't made a judgment, the adult has. And I think when it comes to the law and the rule of law, it's very helpful actually to maintain that distinction, and we could do with arguing for it a lot more, especially when it comes to gang violence and all the rest of it. And I think that the same can be applied to sort of the adult the child who looks after an adult and becomes morally responsible. But I think the key thing we have to do in terms of the justice system is say, look, the acts of children, whether they are more developed or less developed, are qualitatively different to adults. And the missing feature is the capacity to judge. And the law must, I think, lay down that distinction in quite harsh terms, even though it's not completely reflective of reality. I mean, the law very rarely reflects accurately the reality of situations. And you will always have hard cases where you'll have to prosecute a 17-year-old who's stabbed someone and try them in the same way as you would an 8-year-old, which wouldn't make a lot of, which might clang, but it's an exercise of principle in the way that we deal with these things. And I think when it comes to the law and the operation of the law, it's important to have these principles.
Okay, thank you. James.
Yeah, I'd echo a lot of what Luke said. I think one of the things I'd like to come back on is there was some mention earlier on about child protection and the sort of rise of child protection. I'm not sure we're doing a very good job of protecting children. Indeed, I'm not sure we're doing a very good job of defining exactly what childhood is at the moment. And, the drive that created childhood in some ways was a desire to protect children. In part, it was also bound up with a regulatory system that sought to control as well. But in part, it was a desire to protect children. We get it all completely wrong at the moment when we look to protect children. I mean, what are we protecting them from by putting them in our cars to drive them to school? We're creating obesity crises. We're terrified about paedophiles and we don't put them onto the streets. There is definitely a culture of fear, you know, around childhood that's really quite apparent and is encountered. But where we're not very good at protecting children, for example, is in their exposure to advertising, in the way in which their young minds are sort of warped by the continual barrage of consumerism. You know, we're not very good at really deciding what our children are and what we want them to be, and we protect them in all the wrong ways very often. And I'm sure that the path to hell is paved with good intentions. Much of what's been described, particularly with young people and the youth justice system, has been born out of a desire to take young children who are in difficulty and do good for them. But actually there is a lesson that we learn from looking at crime and criminality, and that lesson is this. With the vast majority of young offenders, if you did absolutely nothing, they'd go on to exactly the same outcome as if you do something and you intervene. In the 1960s in the United States of America, the Americans were saying, actually, if you let young offenders out of youth offending institutions, by and large, a large number of them go on not to offend again anyway, or re-offend at exactly the same rate, whether you enforce the full sentence or not. Similarly, they were also noting that in many ways, the best way to absolutely ensure that young people went on to become criminals in a persistent way for the whole of their future was to intervene, and the more that you did, the worse that you'd make them. And actually the principle that we should be following in many ways if we want to protect children is to do as little as possible, as frequently as possible. We don't intervene. We radically make that decision that non-intervention is often the best way, and we only deal with the most problematic and difficult cases. That doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, we let people off the hook for doing bad things. We look at how we deal with young offenders who commit the most serious crimes differently. We look at where we place them. We look at how we treat them. We look at how we rehabilitate them. But in terms of our current attitudes, they're actually creating more social problems than they're solving, and that is problematic.
Okay, Nina.
Okay, so I want to come back on the point about really we shouldn't do anything about children who commit crimes. And I would say that I agree with you very strongly about as little as possible, but you can't just ignore these things that happen. And you know, children are a part of society. And so I'm not advocating that we just leave children to do things that are unpleasant or heinous and affecting other members of society and just ignore it because they're children. What I'm saying is that if we are going to do something about it, and I'm not sure I even have the answer to this, as to what to do, then do it with the understanding that as an adult, as a fully fledged moral agent, you are imposing your moral understanding onto a situation that isn't necessarily genuinely coming from that situation. So the child doesn't have an organic sense of intentionality or a fully sophisticated understanding of the consequences or the costs and benefits of any action, and that's how we think of morality. So we have to be careful not to impose our fully fledged understanding onto a less sophisticated child because we see it in a certain way with all of our understanding and all of our experience tied up into that. And so that is a problem, I think. I just want to quickly touch on the point about children who've had sort of more responsibility. And historically, children who have worked jobs, you know, at the age of 12, had major household responsibilities, been major parts of the family unit, caretakers for their siblings and responsible for meals and things like that. Absolutely, they will have a different developmental trajectory than a 12-year-old that you see today who grows up in a suburban household and you know, comes home after school and is responsible for maybe a chore or two and does some homework. And that's the nature of development, which I think is really interesting. You will not develop all these sophisticated things living on a deserted island. They have to be facilitated through a caretaker, through some adult means, and so you can facilitate that more rapidly in some situations than in others. So I do think there's a point there about the fact that, yeah, historically perhaps we could have looked at moral development as being as coming online more quickly, but today's society, the way we raise children now, I think it's absurd to talk about a 10-year-old having a sophisticated moral sense. And I just want to close on the idea that my main point that I really wanted to drive home today is that there's an excitement in science right now, and science is obviously very, very influential in informing the political decisions that we're making about prosecuting children in the criminal justice system. There's an excitement in science, in psychology, in neuroscience, in probably every aspect of science that's dealing with human beings, to look back as early as possible for any detection of a conceptual understanding, to take adult concepts that are huge, historical, cultural, societal, and just all-encompassing, things like morality, and to look back as early as possible and try to find evidence of it. And it says something, it's a big testament to the fact that we are now trying to reduce adults and human beings to something very meager, something unrecognizable to what we truly think of as being an adult human being, and I think that's a real problem.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Nina. And Ray.
Before we began this debate, I thought this was an extremely complex issue. I now realise I underestimated how complex it is. And as a result of a discussion I've enjoyed a lot, is it touches on some fundamental things. What is agency? Who has it? Who has agency appropriate to any particular situation? And so you can judge them as whether they're criminally responsible or not. What is a child? How do we understand what children are? And also, what is the purpose of the punishment, the justice system, when you're dealing with a young offender? I think those are things that need to be thought of very hard. And that's why as a result of Luke's brilliant presentation on the competitive toughness of successive politicians wanting to show that, to placate the inner Daily Mail in all of us, successive politicians, they've competed to be tough on crime, tough on the cause of crime, etc., etc. I thought Luke said that brilliantly. As a result of the sense of the complexity of this issue, my contempt for those buggers is now even greater than it was before. So I'm really grateful for this because I feel strengthened in my contempt. The final point the gentleman raised, of course, and I think my fellow panellists answered it better than I could, I don't think for a moment one is not taking juvenile crime, or whatever we call it, seriously. I mean, it has to be taken seriously in the right sort of way. I guess that's what we're feeling. And that would be my response, although my fellow panellists put it much better.
Can we thank the speakers?